super excited for our lecturer today, our first lecture of the spring School of Architecture lecture series at UNC Charlotte. And welcome to our panelists here. I want to welcome Rachel Dickey, who's professor in the school, as well as Betsy West, and also Greer, everyone knows, executive assistant. So Rachel is joined here with several of her students. And yeah, I'm very excited for the question and answer session that will follow Jennifer's lecture. I think everyone's familiar with the format now. It's a webinar format. As much as we'd like to see all of your faces, we can't, unfortunately, all those who are not panelists, but we can see your comments and questions in the chat. Time, depending on time, we will try our best to address some of those questions. We might look for trends, or if there's some certain hot button questions, to call those out and prioritize those. But we'll do our best to address the broader discussion as well as focus on this conversation. So with that, I will just transition now to introducing our lecturer today, Jennifer Newsom. It's a huge pleasure to have Jennifer with us. She's one of my favorite architects and favorite people. It's true. And we're former colleagues from Minnesota, so I really miss Jennifer and happy to have her with us. And I'll introduce her here with her bio. Jennifer Newsom received her Bachelor of Arts and Master of Architecture from Yale University. And while she was at Yale, this is thematically related to our lecture series this year and important. She organized the 2-day symposium called Black Boxes, Enigmas of Space and Race, that was held at the school. And Jennifer did something similar. We were trying to organize something similar in Minnesota that took a different form. It was a lecture series that was quite compelling as well. Currently teaching at the University of Minnesota School of Architecture, Jennifer teaches undergraduate and graduate architectural design studios. She is also a past instructor at Juxtaposition Arts, a youth empowerment and apprenticeship program in North Minneapolis. Jennifer's research probes the conceptual space between real bodies made of flesh, steel, concrete, glass, etc., and the recognition of these bodies through images. Using race as a provocative impetus for her work, she is concerned with surface perceptions and the structures that support those readings. She has worked with firms as diverse as Audrey Associates, Deborah Burke Partners. She used to teach with Deborah Burke, Robert Stern Architects, and Cooper Robertson. Her writing has been featured in Metropolis Magazine, Architect Magazine, and Africana, the Encyclopedia of African and African American Experience. Thoroughly pleased to welcome Jennifer, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Blaine. I really appreciate the invitation to be here from both you and from Betsy. And we miss you in Minnesota. I'll just say that. Let's get that out of the way and say it publicly on the record. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see. You're going to see yourselves momentarily here. All right. I think this should be working. So as I said, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here this afternoon. And thanks also to Greer, who helped make sure things run smoothly here in this digital space. So thank you to everyone. Dream the Combine, as Blaine mentioned, is the name of our practice. And I'd be remiss, obviously, if I didn't show a photograph of my other half, Tom Carruthers. In picking the name Dream the Combine, we were searching for something outside of the syntactic confines of language or the corporatized blandness of Newsom plus Carruthers architects. One morning, while we were staying at a friend's house in upstate New York, we asked our then 20-month-old son what he had dreamt about the night before. And yes, he was referring to a combine harvester seen at the farm across the road. The name stuck due to its strangeness, persisting in our memories for 6 months as we moved from New York to Minneapolis with the goal of starting our own practice. Both dream and combine can be nouns or verbs, and this movement between thing and action is a defining oscillation in our work. We are makers committed to arranging physical matter in the world, but we also acknowledge that this is a directed process over which responsibility requires that we are aware of our actions at all levels of it, from conception to design to procurement to fabrication to installation and to the later use. The things we put out into the world are relationships concretized in space, and our firm name speaks to the projective capacity of those collaborative efforts. We aim to work productively with difference, an affirmation of the both and rather than the either or, which is a kind of conceptual stance that extends to the ethos of our practice. Now, if Tom were here, he'd get to present more of his side of the story and how he got to this point in time. He'd probably talk about his early fascination with drawing and trying to negate the image through mark making. He'd talk about metaphor, which I'll talk a little bit about too, as a productive lens through which to understand our work. Now, I'd like to speak briefly about my personal experience as a way of grounding some of our influences in our practice. I've known I wanted to be an architect ever since I was 8 years old, drawing houses on my father's legal pads in a self-made blanket fort underneath our dining room table. It was all I ever wanted to do. But there were many points when I wasn't sure if this profession wanted me. Speaking to the students who are listening, I don't want to be vague about the anti-Blackness and self-alienation I faced while a graduate student. It was often a demoralizing experience where I faced a lot of self-doubt. I think this happens in a lot of grad programs, but architecture can be particularly brutal. I didn't always have language for how I felt at the time, and much of what I did as a student and since has been about the vulnerability of parsing the words, finding the material languages to speak. As Blaine mentioned, when I was a second-year graduate student, I planned and hosted Black Boxes, a 2-day symposium about race and architecture, in part because I was struggling with a statement a professor made early on in my studies. On literally the first day of class, he told us there's no such thing as Black architecture. I was immediately reminded of Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, namely that we Black people exist physically within the world and also within others' perceptions of us in the world. Surviving means a constant negotiation of these two zones, and the inherent doubling creates a feeling of two-ness. I am Black and I'm sitting in the room. I wanted to be an architect. How could the fact of my existence and his statement be reconciled? I had had experiences certainly where I felt at home, I felt encouraged, and I felt that the world was welcoming me on my path to becoming an architect. But it was equally powerful to discover where I felt unwanted, misunderstood, and undervalued. These experiences feel like a kind of sliding on quicksand, always double thinking your next move. The ground is not the ground. There are 2 or 3 or 4 grounds overlaid on top of one another. Corners rise up, stiff walls, a game board that is shifting as you are playing it. Sometimes I feel like I'm not that adept at thinking around corners or seeing through walls. I feel outsmarted by it. My intellectual life is something that I have to cultivate against outside interests that would tell me I'm not smart or good or interesting enough. So our work too is about this seeing around or seeing through or seeing otherwise in a world that prefigures that which we think we know. From the moment my professor said those words, I became increasingly intrigued by the way the surface and the visual perception of it could be contrasted with their converses of depth, mass, and tangibility. Race is a social construct, so it's perhaps a provocative and productive place to reconsider architecture's foundations of surface and support, figure and ground, perception versus reality. These are our basic processes that structure how we choose to relate to one another in the world. What are the preconditions for love that we can establish? How can we, in our work, aim to constantly question rethink, and reimagine what we think we know? If memory is encoding, storage, and retrieval, what is our foundational framework that we continually rehash? The work of Dream the Combine might be described as opening up arenas for other futures. That also means we must reconsider our past, looping through time. My earlier professor thought I had no history, or that somehow my history had nothing to contribute to architecture as a discipline. That there was something universal that somehow, that somehow transcended culture, even as architecture is a product of culture. Gulsum Bedar writes that all cultural systems are constructed in an ambivalent space of enunciation and a discontinuous time of translation and negotiation. As such, the task of architectural discourse then is to fill up that empty space of signification. That is architecture by strategic inclusions and exclusions.
Hey, Jennifer.
So, yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but your screen flickered with an image.
Yeah, no, it's a black screen. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I accidentally clicked forward. I'm just talking.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
And so I very much appreciate, no, it's okay. That's okay. I very much appreciate the space here today to open up a bit of what gets encoded, the empty space of signification, by sharing my work with you this afternoon. We've worked in rural landscapes, transportation corridors, on city streets, and in abandoned infrastructure, often seeking spaces on the margins. We talk about infinity and expansion and multiple possibilities of meaning. We talk about carving up in service of love. We don't necessarily use the words freedom or liberation, but those could apply too. The desire for everyone to experience multiple perspectives is a formal strategy rooted in a radical ethos. We use the languages and the tools we have. So this afternoon, maybe come and walk with me a little bit. I'll take you through a few projects, so hopefully you come away with some more understanding of our work and what motivates it. So the first project that I'm going to show is Hide and Seek, which was a project that we did as part of the Young Architects program, which is, well, they took a pause, so we'll see if it comes back, but it was an annual invited competition where about 50 firms from North America are nominated to submit their qualifications. And we honestly were really surprised to be nominated and actually make it to, to the finalist round. So we thought really carefully about how to kind of present ourselves. The whole project happens on this like really accelerated time frame. I think we answered the initial RFQ like in October. They named the finalists by November. We give a final presentation in January. They let the winners know by the beginning of March, and then the whole project opens at the end of June. So it's like really, really fast. So for us, it was important to kind of work out of our own work, but also really think kind of critically about how to reach this very specific audience and how to connect with the jury that was primarily made up of curators and not so many architects. So we kind of started here an artwork with people, with public space. And this is a piece called Art Is by Lorraine O'Grady that I realized apparently Joe Biden and Dream the Combine like think alike, because the Biden campaign also released a video after they won the election that kind of riffs off of this sort of motif that's presented in this work. But this is a kind of original, which was made, and Lorraine O'Grady made this work in response to a friend who told her that conceptual art didn't care about Black people. So there's this kind of attitude of notions of care, of preserving, of tending in these photographs. And something about the kind of immediate presentness of the moment that became really kind of special in this public artwork that she had made. And it consists of these kind of 15 dancers who are all wearing white and moving through the crowd during this parade in Harlem in 1983, and gilt frames. And And so I think these framing devices are operating on a lot of different levels, right? There's the kind of physical reality of what they are. But then there's also the sort of meaning of what these forms represent, right? That there's this kind of canonizing gaze, this art historical canon. And does, are these the type of individuals who are normally within that frame? And I think what's so beautifully captured by these pictures is the ways in which the frame gets transgressed, right? The kind of direct address of looking through, looking beyond. And each one of these pictures is like kind of beautifully cropped, right? So you have the sort of bounding edge of the photograph itself and then these kind of framing devices within it. But also they're kind of operating within this public space of the street, which also has its kind of regularizing borders, in this case, the police line. For us thinking about PS1, the trick became this refusal of the border under the constraint of border's constant imposition. So this is the site that we were contending with. And the courtyard at MoMA PS1 is kind of like this odd shape that's sort of resultant from all of these intersecting street grids. And so, we can't get rid of these walls, like these 15-foot high concrete walls. Like, this is the fact of where we're building. They exist. But how do we insert something that acts as a refusal, a reordering of this space, to try and create some sort of stage for belonging? Borders are funny things. They're two-faced chameleons, changing in attitude depending on which side of them you're on. The PS1 courtyard is a space that is both inclusive, a taking in, a sheltering of the kind of precious contents, and exclusive, shutting out, highlighting the in crowd versus the others. The 15-foot high walls mark both a refuge and an exclusion. It is, without a doubt, political, and yet also experiential, and a metaphor for the oscillations of the troubled times we're in. Our proposal was a provocation exploring the dual nature of this frame. We posited a kind of intersect of lines that started to destabilize the fixity of its edges, and more broadly, the kind of hegemonic or normative view and way of moving through this space. So we were trying to kind of take on the responsibility of these overlapping systems, narratives, and pluralities of use. So in this space, we kind of inserted this sort of imaginative network. And it builds off of an earlier project, which if we have time, I will show, called Longing. That was the first time that we kind of paired these two inward-facing mirrors relative to one another. And so I think, Longing, that earlier project, was sort of like one instance, and then Hide and Seek is like 9 of them all intersecting with each other. To kind of create this sort of mass parallel series of kind of intersecting void spaces. And some of these images are from our kind of competition proposal. I'm seeing my water bottle, which I have now in front of me too, in a much more battered state. And these little models we called them the urchins, and each one of them showed how this kind of imaginative or projective space in the depth of the image of these two mirrors facing each other would start to kind of carve the walls of the courtyard in different configurations. So as these mirrors move relative to each other, because they're all hinged and gimbaled, you get, instead of maybe a single line kind of extending in a more normative way in the distance, you get these kind of flexing torus shapes or kind of odd Klein bottles and other kind of imagined forms. And so when we were trying to communicate this to the jury, these are kind of some images of the competition phase. This is at the shop in the University of Minnesota, and standing here with a number of students. Made this really kind of elaborate model. And at the points where these kind of lines intersected the walls of the courtyard, we actually removed panels at those points in kind of selective areas, kind of encouraged the jury to get down and sort of look into the space of the model. And I should go back and talk about Emmy briefly. Emmy Tong. She had the distinct pleasure of, I will see if it was a pleasure, but of 3D printing and hand painting all of our scale figures. And we didn't glue any of them down. And so every time we moved the model was also a kind of check on our own assumptions of how people might gather in this space, thinking about how to position different bodies in this environment. And so the development of the project, after we were awarded the commission, we worked with an engineer, Clayton Binkley, who's been a kind of constant collaborator of ours. I think we've worked with him on maybe 7 projects up until now. And so the way we work is through this kind of highly coordinated Rhino model. And again, because of the really fast timelines, some of the drawings are just like drawn by hand and sketches going back and forth between us and the engineer. And then moving on site, getting this very big thing up in a very tight space. And this was the kind of final work installed. And the program for the young architects every year is really actually quite simple. You just have to provide seating, shading, and water. And so we kind of arrange those sectionally. So seating at the base, shade canopy above, and then these upper trusses carried a kind of misting, evaporative cooling system. But also we considered how these different volumes would start to frame different programmatic areas, right? So it wasn't just simply a kind of object that plunk sits in the center of the space, but it starts to really kind of participate in the sculpting of the environment in which it's situated. So this line here starts in the kind of smaller courtyard as a large urban scaled hammock, and then comes across and becomes another sort of secondary stage in the main courtyard space. For this piece here starts to form a long runway that almost again became like another kind of space of performance. So that's that long runway here. The hammock is a tiny little seat in the baby courtyard. And then that secondary stage where they'd also have the technical booth when they had larger performances. And each one of these volumes is sort of an extension of these kind of paired mirror spaces. So you have this perspective through the wall. And we're really interested in this kind of imaginative space that exists within the two-dimensional plane of the mirror, that it might start to carve out these other kinds of spaces that would be layered simultaneously with the real environment. Each of the mirrors is supported by kind of brace frames. So if you take your sort of typical like X bracing, we actually distended that into kind of a pyramidal form. But these structures actually took out all the kind of lateral forces from the structure and transferred those down to the ground. But in a way, this kind of infinite reflection is basically like a single point perspective drawing where there's a kind of wandering vanishing point at the center. And so this pyramidal frame also kind of concentrates your attention to that center point of the image. And then this kind of back arm was actually a counterweight that had it's a hollow pipe, and then we would put a sort of steel slug inside of it as a way to kind of counterbalance the mirror and have a sort of home position. And then as I showed in the earlier photograph of the competition model, where those volumes intersected the wall, we actually made these really large murals out of graphite on both the inside and the outside of the wall. So it was another kind of point of registration of how these things were piercing through the existing context. So here's a kind of in process, I guess, because the ladder is still there. For some reason, we have like no pictures of the outside. But here's an image that shows that graphite mural. And then another one a little bit later on in the summer as the rain has started to kind of wash it away. But you're seeing that kind of ghosted form, and then also oddly completed in the mirror facing it. And then up above, again, trying to think about, what are all the ways in which we could kind of move outside of the confines of the courtyard. The upper two trusses actually are like these huge periscopes. So there's sort of a central point that you can stand and have a view out to this street corner. So, the museum is technically free for all New Yorkers, but on Saturdays they have this big party called Warm Up that usually draws about 5,000 people. And so, not everybody has $25, so you can still stand out here and see a bit of the action inside and hear the music. And so this is that original, that same view now with our installation installed. So there's a kind of reordering of the space. It operates on maybe some of your kind of preconceived expectations of how you might navigate this space. But also, we were really excited that we got some great feedback from the security people who work here, that it caused them to see the space in a new way. Here are the people who know exactly what happens when it rains. When you have a bunch of people in the courtyard, what they do, they all rush into the museum, the main building of the museum, or they know this place really intimately. And so to get them to have a kind of unusual and unique new experience was really exciting to us. So it kind of reordered the space, reordered the bodies in that space, introduced a sort of glitchiness to the environment. Moments where what seemed like a solid wall might peel out and become a thin plane. And then that misting system that I talked about not only provided cooling during a kind of hot summer day, it also kind of introduced this sort of atmospheric static into the scene. So it kind of pulsated on and off at a sort of randomized interval as a way to kind of clear the visual field to a certain extent. And at night, we actually use the mist as a kind of literal watercolor and carrier of lighting in the evening. So this project had two types of audiences. So everything from the kind of more calm and contemplative single visitor on a abandoned on a sparsely populated Wednesday afternoon to a Saturday music festival where there are upwards of 5,000 people in attendance. And so I really love this image because it talks about this kind of replication of the crowd and building a sort of much more kind of populated area from this kind of singular hammock space, like kind of replicating into the distance. And, we thought about, like all the different things that you do at a party, right? Like, there's a kind of C&B scene of, later on in the evening, people dancing on this platform, kind of becoming performers for each other. There's also, when you get to a really loud party and you're like, where are my friends? I don't know where people are. At the front end of this runway, which is oddly what you're seeing in this side image here, this was kind of like the front porch where people could gather and had sort of a definable spot to meet up with each other. And this is a view of the courtyard about, I would say like 75% full. They really crammed them in here, maybe 80%. And we also had a pretty robust, other part of the project that was all about programming, how to activate these spaces. Like we wanted to have a long community meal on this runway space, so we kind of sized it accordingly for that. And this was a double Dutch performance that happened at one of the kind of evening events at the museum. But it turned out that, museums are complicated, multi-headed these. And while there was a lot of support for some of our programming ideas, they also admitted that they were maybe more comfortable with objects than with people. So take that what you will. But I'll end with a couple of films. So this is, you know, sort of an Instagram post from the then director of the museum of PS1, Klaus Biesenbach. And then I'll show a longer film that is not really quite documentary, but it starts to get at kind of the mood of the installation, or one aspect of the mood of the installation. And it's become a really important part of our process to utilize film to tell other stories about the work that we're doing. So I'll show a couple of those throughout the presentation. Exit this for a second. And I realize I apologize. I actually can't see any of you as I'm talking. So All right. As I mentioned, that's a film that we made with Isaac Gale, who is a pretty incredible artist and musician in his own right. And oddly enough, after working with us, he's like, I want to go to architecture school. And I'm like, oh man, we've like corrupted his mind in some strange way. But it's been really wonderful getting to kind of reimagine the work with him. In the interest of time, I think maybe I will skip ahead. And I'm going to talk about this project Lure, which we completed in 2019. Kind of a different context, still within the vein of being in the art world, but this time in an interior space in a gallery. So in some ways, hide and seek it creates this kind of illusory depth that gets kind of complicated with the sort of the reality in which you're situated, right? So we would have people who would stand in that hammock space, and when the mirrors would move around them, they would actually lose their balance, right? So their physical environment hadn't actually changed, but the kind of feedback loop between their vision, what they were actually seeing, and how it kind of conditioned the body was very immediate in other ways. And I think with Allura, what we were really interested is taking that space that's within the depth of the mirror and building it. So Lure becomes this kind of image that you can step into. In our practice, we often kind of utilize languages of film and theatrical scenography, so media of representation and reality, to engage with the complexities of narrative, image, space, and direct experience. So, you know, the previous work kind of considered a mirror's capacity to imply a flexing depth within a flat plane. Here, movement across the threshold takes the audience into the space of the image itself. So the entire front facade of the gallery is masked in this blue debris netting, which has the effect of kind of editing the building out of our awareness. There were numbers of times when we were trying to have meetings with people and they were like, where are we meeting you? Like, we can't even find this place. And we're like, no, it's the big blue thing. Like, you can't miss it. But in a way, it kind of, you know, recalls these sort of urban blind spots in Seattle's fabric, right? It's a city that's undergoing kind of incredible levels of development. And this blue facade, this debris netting, in some ways, like situates this site as a space in a kind of temporal transition, right? It's a space of a time between, right? It's not quite what it was before. It's not quite what it's going to be in the future. So in that way, it kind of introduces, it locates the space into in a kind of dislocates it from its kind of present time. And so we were really interested in trying to capture people's attention and folding this kind of exterior space of the street into this interior environment in the gallery. So you're actually walking on this outside surface that like folds in. And, you know, we were kind of using the street elevation as this scene franz, which is the backdrop of a theatrical stage. And we were looking a lot at Palladio and Scamozzi's efforts in the Veneto at Teatro Olimpico. And I really love this drawing. It's kind of a section and elevation and a perspective all in one. A sort of use of scenographic depth to insert a public space into the interior environment of the theater. So in plan, you know, that section was cut through here. So you're seeing into these kind of perspectively described interior street scenes that were the backdrop of the theatrical space. And in our instance, that front facade was here on the right side of the image, and we used it as this kind of perspectival space as a way to bring you up to these big skylights that were in the back of the gallery. And so in our early site visits to the gallery, it was almost as though we felt like there was this kind of circulatory system that existed there that was kind of latent. And so in some ways, our piece kind of physicalizes that too. So this is the Teatro Olimpico plan. This is ours. where that space of the street starts to get knotted and folded and looped onto itself. So you're kind of pulled from this sort of stippled space of the street into this kind of series of interior passageways in this continual loop. And so I'll show a few images. I have one more film, which I'm kind of looking at time like, maybe we have time to look at it, maybe we don't. It's shorter, it's 3 minutes. But I can switch over to showing that now. Oh, one thing actually that I did want to say about blue before I do that. And I'll just click through these images while I'm talking. The choice of blue is pretty intentional, not only because it has a kind of vibrancy in the hue, but this debris netting, you can get it in green, you can get it in blue, you can get it in red, yellow, purple, all sorts of different colors. But for us, we really wanted to use blue because it also kind of participates in this language of like film post-production, right? You've heard of the green screen or the blue screen does exactly the same thing. And those colors are chosen because they don't really show up in people's skin tones. And so there's this film process called chroma key composting where it's a post-production technique for layering one space or one image on top of another. So again, that like the kind of color of the material, the way it's utilized also sort of participates in this language of kind of jump cutting between different scenes. So I'm going to switch to this film now. I think I'm really excited to show these videos because like we've been working on them for a really long time, and so I'm like, finally, we can show these. But I'll kind of end here at the conclusion of this film, again made in collaboration with Isaac. maybe I'll stop here. Happy to
Wow.
have any questions.
Jennifer, I'm going to just refer to the chat. Amelia Mitchell says, wow, that was amazing. Sums it up, Amelia.
Thanks, Amelia. I appreciate it.
and Lydia Thompson says, sheesh. So you got amazing and sheesh. Yeah, that sums it up. I'm going to let Rachel take it away. Rachel, if you'd like to introduce your students, and you and your students can ask questions of Jennifer.
Yes, thank you so much for that provocative lecture. I really appreciate the way your practice invites the public to touch, enter, and experience the work. And I know the students here have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to start off by asking specifically about your practice and how it seems to involve both a practice and discourse around architecture. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the role of the installation and how you might respond to critics that differ the installation as a kind of absence of a real building, and the distinction between—
Talk to my engineer about that. Like, let's come on. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
yeah, no, just could you talk a little bit more about the role of the installation? That would be great. And those critics are not myself, I would say.
no. It's I mean, I feel like it's a yeah, usually when we give a talk, there's like always a question that like sort of circles around that and some, touches on it in some way, like, well, don't you just want to do buildings? And it's like, well, we consider them to be, I mean, they're not technically buildings, right? They don't have HVAC systems, but they're architecture. And I think there's something very kind of liberating, very immediate, very powerful about kind of working in the installation space for us in our practice. I've certainly worked at a lot of architecture firms where I'd be there working on something for like 3 years and it still wouldn't be built. So, or 5 years and it still wouldn't be built. So I think for us, it's a way to kind of operate nimbly and just like build things. Like we want to build stuff. So, not to say that we wouldn't, work on a sort of more traditional built project, but I think we're just able to say different things operating in this format. Yeah, I mean, they're still like rigorously detailed and they have to stand up and they can't like kill people, so that like they have ways in which they engage in the world. There's still big honking things that are environments that people can be in. So, I don't know if I'm like really directly answering your question, but I think the installation space is one where we've just been able to find our voice. Like, when we started our practice, we were doing the things that like all beginning practices do. We were doing a little bit of everything, but we were always kind of doing these installations concurrently. So then when we were in Minneapolis and we moved to Canada for 3 years, and then when we moved back to the United States, we were like, what would happen if we just focused on installations? Like that's the thing that seems to kind of fuel us. That's the thing that's gotten kind of the most critical attention, that's kind of had the most traction, that's actually continually gotten built, because many of those other projects, kind of had fits and starts and ended for a variety of reasons that were kind of outside of our control. So, some of it is also just like focusing for a time. And that's been, I think it's been really helpful for us to just kind of hone in on what motivates us. Like, what is it that we're trying to say? What's our language? Like what are the tools that we're operating with? So.
Thank you. We have a large panel here, so I'm going to call on Teddy and see if she has any questions.
Yes, I do have a question. So I recognize that your past installations, they encompass, they're very, they have like a multidisciplinary kind of approach, like whether it's arts or architecture, social or cultural theory. I'm just most curious about what influences your creative process, and like which is likely to be your starting point?
Ooh, that's a great question. Gosh, I feel like for us, inspiration comes from a lot of different sources, and so I think you're valid in like picking up on that, right? Like sometimes it might be visual art, it might be a piece of music. We did a whole installation where we were listening to a lot of Marvin Gaye, and we're like, okay, the name of the piece is "The World Is Rated X." Like that's the name of the piece, which is a song by Marvin Gaye, and there's a line in that song where he says, not only in the movie shows take a look outside, it's where the truth is really told. And that like really resonated with us. Again, this kind of like oscillation between the sort of illusion of a kind of constructed narrative in a film, right, versus like the world outside, like that's enough, right? Like there's a lot happening there. So how do we make these kind of insertions into that real world that speak to that kind of duality? So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of our process, like I like to write a lot. I know I need to publish more as part of my tenure thing. Blaine used to be my like my mentor, like the person presenting my tenure case to the rest of the faculty of the University of Minnesota. And I'd always be like, Blaine, I know I need to write more. But in terms of my process, it's actually a really big part of it. Like we'll often say that a project starts with an image and some text. And like in the pairing of those two things, like that's the statement of the concept that like the rest of the work hangs on, right? Like that that initial RFQ for MoMA PS1, the project pretty much looks like that. Like when I remember this distinct moment when we went to the final thing and we were like, yep, this is what I imagined in my mind. Like this is it. And it came from like this very early on, just like this piece of text that we wrote and one rendering that we made. And a lot of things fed into that, building consensus with all the different people that we worked with fed into that initial image and text. So yeah, that's probably a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think it can start in a lot of different places, and often it can start with architecture, right? With the Teatro Olimpico example, and like thinking about like transforming the canon or riffing off the canon in some way. So sometimes it can be architecture, but a lot of times it's not.
Hey, Jasir.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. My name is Jocelyn Mills. I guess one question for me, sort of looking at some of the work that you've shown, also looked at some previous lectures that you've done, such as like installations as Longing and Hide and Seek. I noticed that there was an emphasis on the diversity of people who come and interact with that space, who live in that community. So how important is it to you as Black architect and designer to revive these ancient sort of artifacts or fragments in these spaces that serve the public?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because I think we always say the public as though that's like some monolithic thing, right? And there's so many different types of people that are out there on the street walking around doing their thing, right? And I think that architecture, if it takes its role seriously, right? Like one of, I think our ability to create that space of welcome is something that we have to like take head on, right? Like that's a responsibility that we have. Like how can our work try and bring people in, bring people together? And so I think, in the instance of Hide and Seek, the material palette is like, pretty restrained. It's like, a lot of industrial materials, it's not very colorful, right? But it actually takes on all the colors of its environment. Like you see the blue of the sky filtered through that fabric. You see the life of the people reflected in the mirrors, right? It actually becomes incredibly like sensorially rich and colorful and dense. And I think that part of it is like setting the stage for us to just see each other and like share in an experience together, right? And I don't know. I don't think that can be understated. Like that architecture sets the stage for something to happen, right? Like people come together in that place and they do something. In our case, we're making these kind of installations that are sort of weird. Like maybe that's the provocation, that like brings people in and they're like, whoa, okay, this is sort of weird. Like, you know? But then they come away having shared something together, and maybe it allows them to enter into conversation in a way that like they wouldn't normally do. We had an earlier proposal that I didn't show here. It was a proposal that didn't end up turning into a project, but it was actually the first thing that Tom and I actually did. It's funny, he's standing literally like right next to right next to you. So I like keep like turning to him. Yeah, hi. It's the funny thing of being in virtual space. But yeah, an early project that was actually the first time that we worked together before Dream the Combine was like even a thing. Was for doing an installation in the New York City subway station that would have taken the end walls of adjoining stations and done like live feed video projections on those end walls, but the video feed would be of the next station. So it was a way of like kind of collapsing and like jump cutting between the space that you were in and like moving into the next station, right? And so, you know, we were living in New York at the time, and you have these incredible juxtapositions, right? Like 59th Street actually connects directly to 125th Street. Like, you know, these two neighborhoods that seem, you know, very disconnected from each other culturally, economically, in so many different ways, they actually could be collapsed and start to be in some sort of dialogue with one another through the mechanism of our installation. So, I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about maybe like just Black audiences specifically, but it's meant to, I think, bring all kinds of people together and in dialogue with one another. You know, I think that people might even just look at the two of us, right? Like the fact of our practice already transgresses a number of perceived boundaries, right? Like I'm American, he's Canadian, so, you know, he's not actually from this country, which, yeah, I know it's Canada, you're like, oh, it's like not that much different, but it's actually a lot different. You know, Black, white, male, female, architecture artist, like he trained as a sculptor. And an architect, yes, I know. Yeah, we met in architecture school. But, you know, it's like, how do we break down some of these binaries? Like that's what we're trying to do. So making a space for all of us to be together.
Excellent. Alex?
Hey, Jennifer, thank you for your time today. I wanted to sort of ask your advice on, now that we're, you know, about to graduate and become baby architects. I read your piece on Architect Magazine about Whitney Young's speech, and I want to know what your thoughts or sort of arguments are when you have to face other architects who don't see maybe the need to fight for equity within the architectural discipline and or projects that they might be taking part in.
Well, I think those folks are getting fewer and farther between because of young people and because like times change, and you know, it's just the way of the world that we gotta like value all the differences that make a difference and that make us unique and that make us incredible contributors to society, like whatever your background is. So I fortunately have not had that many instances recently, probably because I've also like designed my life in such a way that like I surround myself with the people who support me, who build me up. It might be part of the reason why I don't work in a firm anymore, from some earlier experiences that were like, you know, hard. But at the same time, like it was really important for me to get my license. So like I worked in architecture firms and like, you know, did all my tests and did my internship and did that whole thing because I think it's really important to be counted, especially if you're a woman or a person of color. It's really important to be counted. And now, luckily, there's ways in which you can, you know, take your exams and do that kind of thing while you're still in school and get that kind of professional experience. But I think, you know, it doesn't mean that you have to like put yourself in a situation that's not healthy and uncomfortable, that is uncomfortable for you, right? Like, so I think, you know, I love how you said you're going to be a baby architect. I think, you know, even when you might not feel like you're in the position of most power, you can still be a very powerful advocate in that role. Yeah, I am reminded by our kids one day saying to us, even Martin Luther King was a baby. Malcolm X was a baby. Gandhi was a baby. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, all these people at one point were your age, were just kids, you know? Like, so I think, you know, you can be an advocate, you can be centered in your kind of, you know, what your ethics are at any stage, right? Like, you don't have to be like name on the door architect to like have a position. So yeah, I would recognize your own agency, but I think it's also important to like find the mentors who are going to be supportive, because it's not always going to be that easy. You know, I have some mentors who I really like rely on, and some of those folks are my peers, right? Like over the summer, you know, I think it was a really challenging time. It still is a very challenging time. I mean, I'm here in Minneapolis. I live in Seward, and much of our main street has been burned down. And, you know, a man lost his life, and so many people have lost their lives for like just ridiculous reasons, right? I mean, it's a tragedy. So how are we going to like reconcile with that? Like, what are we going to do? And so increased pressure is being put on our discipline to answer for the ways in which we participate in environmental racism, for the ways in which we have widened the wealth gap in terms of you know, home ownership or access to capital in those sorts of ways. Like the ways in which, yeah, the built environment is so implicated in all of these like social concerns, economic concerns, like just like, I mean, I do think it comes down to like, how do we want to be together? And so I do feel like the people who maybe are more resistant to that, they're just getting drowned out at this point. It's like, no, bye, we're like moving on. Like we're going and we got to like go in the direction of progress, you know? So I think, you know, I would just encourage you to find the people who are also on that train with you. That was a very long answer. Got it. We're gonna have like time for no more questions.
Thank you.
Hopefully we have time for a couple more. Will?
Yeah, first I just want to thank you for sharing some incredible work, both the work itself, and I really enjoyed the videos, and that kind of leads into my question. It relates to the parallels between film and your work in terms of how you play with perspective, illusory depth, and even shows up in your material choices. And you've shown examples of how you've collaborated with other artists to document your projects through video. I'm curious if you ever treat these resulting videos as kind of a feedback loop. Do you ever revisit them and allow them to influence your process or decision-making in new projects?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Tom looks like he wants to answer that question. Do you want to come and talk? You should.
I mean, I can always talk, but I think they're more interested in what you have to say.
No, I mean, I think it's a really great question. And I do think we learned from them, you know.
Let's talk about Make It Rain. Right?
Oh,
like,
okay,
that's
yeah.
a super clear instance.
Okay, you talk about that. You're getting a twofer.
The questions are really great. And I really just want to say that I love kind of being slightly off screen, because I learn, like in this moment right now, like I'm learning about my own work and where it's going to go. Like Jennifer and I, like it's a partnership, right? There's a collaboration here. And so there's a kind of model of distributed authorship, which, you know, in the art world, let's just talk about what we know. Like I think if we're being honest with ourselves, like there's no one person that's controlling the outcome of a particular project. The number of voices that are going into it are quite extraordinary. And that includes the voices of the people who are I don't know that I like the term using a building, but like participating in the life of that place. I think challenging ideas of authorship is very important. So to answer the question more directly, we did a video of a piece called Make It Rain. And that project, like many of ours, have go up so quickly that I almost couldn't spend time with it when it was up. I think it took me at least a month, maybe two, and it was only up for 2.5 months before I could actually go there and without kind of dealing with the anxiety of like just the process of getting it up and
like worrying about like, are people going to damage it? Because it's like this very kind of vulnerable material, again, in a public space.
The video was crucial because the video has this close up, and it showed how the steam that comes out of the piece condenses on the inside of this kind of soft reflective surface, and it comes out and drips off the bottom. And it is so visceral. And at once, on the one hand, like ideas of sweat and anxiety, but others, it's like also extremely sexy. And here's this invisible body on a plinth in one of the most public corners of Vancouver. And I don't think I kind of understood what the piece was not. Like, it's not street furniture, it's not architecture, but I didn't know what the piece was really for or what it was about. And that little video there, seen through another's eyes, I think really helped me in that instance. But I don't want to take your
That was a great
away.
answer, what he said. No, I mean, I totally agree. It's like, that was a great example because we saw the footage and we were like, wow. I mean, we had thought about that piece as a figure, right? Because it's very tall, slender, and it kind of almost disappears when there's a crowd moving through that sidewalk. But the way that they captured it in the film, it just made it that much more like, it just made that much more to the forefront. And it kind of, we realized that like, oh no, that actually is a really important part of the narrative, that maybe we should like think about how we talk about it differently. Like if we're going to do another piece that kind of riffs off of that or like moves forward from that work, like we're going to learn from what was discovered there. And I think even like your questions, right, and your comments, that like that's super important to us, or even like the Instagram posts that people would make from PS1. Yeah. It's like we looked at those of like, okay, how are people actually occupying this? Are they doing what we thought they would do? I mean, we hope they're not, because that's kind of the point, right? It's like to see what comes up that is unexpected. So yeah, I feel like it's all learning. Like once we actually finish the work, that's kind of like the beginning again. So looping, I think we're using looping a lot in our practice, like materially and kind of conceptually too.
Sorry, exit stage left here.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you for the answer.
Thanks,
yeah, that was great.
This is like phone a friend. I can be like, well, he's right here. No, I mean, I have the pleasure of getting to work with like, my best friend. We're married, we have 2 kids. We've known each other for a really long time. So there's also a kind of like shorthand that we have with each other that I think is, I don't know, a big part of, I think, what makes our practice successful.
Okay, one last question. Rick, do you want to wrap this up for us?
Sure. Hi, I'm Rick. So earlier you mentioned that the desire to experience or express multiple perspectives is a root or a driving factor to most of your projects. Your work gives a different experience and perception on how space or what space could be by removing certain boundaries. Do you see yourself, or do you have any goals in trying to change or influence the construct of how space or the way space is designed in the current discipline?
Okay, now he's like really, I mean, can you say a little bit more about that? Like expand off of the last half of your question, the latter part of your question.
Okay,
almost redefining the potential for space and reimagining what space is capable of, is maybe my interpretation of the question in some ways, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways of knowing, right? Like maybe in the work that I showed today, focus a lot on vision and movement. And I think I'm really, even just talking about like someone losing their balance because of the kind of understanding of space that they got through their eyes, like through the mirrors, like kind of making this wobbly environment. And so thinking about the ways in which those are intertwined, but there's lots of other ways of knowing too, and which I think can change your conception of space and like how it maybe, yeah, I think like what it can contain might also be challenged by those different ways of knowing, right? Like if you think about a different notion of time that's more circular, space could be both representative of the present, the passing, they could have the present, the past, and the future, like within that same container. So I think there's like a lot of, obviously at the end of the day, it's like there's physics and we're like dealing with sort of, material things in physical space. But I think that it can get loaded and charged with a lot of different meanings. And I think we're kind of interested in the simultaneity of all of those different meanings, right? And we're two individuals, we're only coming to it with a few of those between us, but that it can hold a lot. It can bear more loads than maybe I think we've kind of traditionally invested it with, right? So I don't know, it's a really provocative question that I feel like I need to spend some more time with. But I think at the root of it for me is that like we're trying to open up this space of like multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of experiencing, that it's not so fixed. There's not just like one right way, right? There's not one right way for any of it. For us to like have a practice, for us to like define our practice in the world, for us to make environments in which people have to like confront something, right? Like you're bringing your own history with you into that space. And so like so much of it is outside of our control as the architect, but I can like, we can make something that maybe like acts as a provocation or a challenge or brings people together or disperses them. Like it can do the opposite things too, right? So I don't know. I feel like our primary material, is this kind of this negative space, like for lack of a better term. And Blaine, I know you've spent a lot of time in Japan, and we're kind of putting together a proposal for a potential fellowship in Japan where we want to like research a lot more about Ma and negative space. So like that is like we need to dive into it. So maybe I'll contact you to have more of a lengthy discussion about that. But yeah, there's so many, we came out of a particular kind of lineage of architectural education. There's lots of other ways of like entering into thinking about space than what we learned at, the schools that we went to, or even the life experiences that we've had, right? So yeah, I'm kind of here for all of it and like wanting to just learn more. And I think each time we make something, we're learning more.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I wish we could just stay all afternoon and
yeah, you have to go to studio.
I know you all have to go to studio. Wow. And thank you, Rachel, and your students for great questions. And I'm so sorry, there's some great questions in the chat. We're recording this, so we can record those just for later consideration. And because I think they're great. It's been a really important discussion. And I'll close just by saying, Jennifer, it's really been an honor to invite you in this capacity. I've really enjoyed seeing your work develop over the years and always been impressed by it. But just thinking about our particular moment right now, it seems like this work really strikes a chord of what we need in ways that I couldn't have anticipated a couple of years ago. So thinking about this new kind of civil rights movement that we're in, thinking about how COVID has dispersed us into isolated pockets, right, apart from each other. The fact that your work brings people together in such a meaningful way, and encourages us and welcomes us to see each other afresh is exactly what we need right now. So I just really appreciate you joining us, and Tom joining us today. Thank you so much.
No, it was a real pleasure. I really like the questions were awesome. So thank you all for your attention and I don't know, and of giving of yourselves in asking the questions and kind of engaging with the answers. So yeah, really, it's been a great experience. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inspiring us today, Jennifer.